Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sally Whipple, and I'm so happy to welcome you to Connecticut's Old State House today for one of our conversations at noon, which is supported by Connecticut Humanities and hosted by Diane Smith, who every month helps us explore a historical topic with a current events twist. Today's program digs into something that we've decided to call the Prudence Crandall effect. Many of you know the story of our state heroine, Prudence Crandall, and although she herself ended up leaving Connecticut forever, her actions in the 1830s reverberated throughout the Civil War era and continue to affect us today. We'll first hear a brief overview of Crandall's impact on 19th century Connecticut, then Diane will spark a discussion that brings Crandall's story into the 21st century. Diane is the Connecticut Network's senior producer for program development. Many organizations have recognized her work as a journalist, author, and video producer, and she has been honored as an unofficial but very effective ambassador for the state of Connecticut. Please join me in welcoming Diane, who will introduce our distinguished guests.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. As some of you may already know because of the cameras in the back, we are taping this. This will be broadcast on CTN, the Connecticut Network. You'll be able to watch it either on television, where it will air a number of times, or you'll be able to check it out on the web. So I encourage you later to go to ct-n.com and look for the rebroadcasts of this and spread the word to your friends. So we do these, as Sally mentioned, every month. And I have to tell you that Connecticut's position on the abolition of slavery has been a pretty hot topic, not just here, but around the country, since last month when we held our Old State House conversation on the Emancipation Proclamation. That talk was given by Professor Matt Warschauer, who happens to be with us today. He is, besides being a professor of history at Connecticut Central State University, also the co-chair of the Connecticut Civil War Commemoration Committee. And he revealed last month in his talk that the Spielberg movie, Lincoln, and screenwriter Tony Kushner had somewhat misrepresented how the Connecticut congressional delegation voted on the passage of the 13th Amendment. Now, the movie shows at least one member of that delegation voting against the amendment, and that the movie, not Matt's talk, but the movie, led to a complaint by Congressman Joe Courtney, who maintains that Connecticut was on the right side of the issues of emancipation and the abolition of slavery. And he actually went into the national media, as some of you may have followed, and requested that Steven Spielberg change that portion of the Oscar-nominated film to show that 4 congressional representatives from Connecticut voted in favor of the 13th Amendment. As part of Courtney's message, he cited the thousands of Connecticut men who fought and died in the Civil War in order to free the slaves. But as Professor Warschauer would tell you, and as he explained in his powerful talk here last month, that indicated that most of Connecticut was strongly in favor of emancipation, when in fact he has proof that that was not the case. And as the professor told us last month, the main motivation for Connecticut men fighting and dying in the Civil War, which they did in very great numbers, was more their desire to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. Well, today we decided we'd go a little bit deeper into the topic with historian Carol Patterson-Martineau. I should tell you that history is Carol's second career. She worked for many years in clinical and research hematology before beginning her master's degree in a real blood sport, American history. She is working on her master's at Central Connecticut State University. Now, Carol's family has lived in Windham County for 17 generations. She grew up well steeped in Connecticut history and genealogy. Carol's interest in the Civil War, as experienced by the northeastern Connecticut townships, began while she was doing research for a graduate course taught by Dr. Warschauer. Her work is going to be included as a chapter in the upcoming volume of essays, Inside Connecticut and the American Civil War, One State Struggle, to be published later this year by Wesleyan Press. Carol's master's thesis expands further on her original work by comparing the Civil War experience of Windham County with those experiences of Litchfield County. So, please welcome Carol.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Ellen Larnard was an amateur historian. She wrote a very comprehensive history of Windham County in the 1880s, and she wrote, "Looking back, Miss Crandall did not succeed in teaching many colored girls, but she educated the people of Windham County. Violence elicited sympathy, and in the resultant agitation, mind and conscience were enlightened." Now, when I started this topic, I was fresh from examining the historiography of the Civil War that said Northern soldiers weren't fighting to free the slaves. And when I started looking at the Windham County transcript, which began fighting to free the slaves about the time that they fired on Fort Sumter, all I could think of was, why this exception? Why are these soldiers writing that the cause of their struggle, that they volunteered and enlisted and fought to free slaves? What made this different? And Edward Ayers, who wrote In the Presence of Mine Enemies, says that controversy over slavery in a community or in an individual is usually brought about by moral outrage or past insult or some event that stimulates discussion and prompts change of attitude, examination of ideas. And to my mind, this had to be the Prudence Crandall scandal, which did erupt in 1833. And it made of Windham County, which was already the red-headed stepchild of the state, in their isolation. They stood alone in this abolitionist movement that began from the very start of the war. The historiography of Connecticut and the Civil War is interesting. It changes as generations of historians change. John Niven, who was commissioned in 1965 to write a book about Connecticut and the Civil War, did not mention slavery at all. Of course, that was in the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and it was probably a matter of not wanting to rock boats. And until my mentor, Dr. Warshauer, published his book, that was the end-all, be-all on commentary on Connecticut, its participation in the Civil War. So looking at this on a town-by-town basis is important. We all want to be on the right side of history, but it's not a reflection on us if we struggled to get there. And that is the concept that I really wanted to concentrate when I looked at Prudence Crandall and her effect. Now, the story has been oversimplified. Prudence Crandall's story has been oversimplified, and it turned into a Quaker schoolmarm teaching colored girls to read. Actually, it was a lot more complicated than that. She was retained by the town of Canterbury to start a very upscale boarding school for wealthy white ladies, and their motivation was economic. They saw this as bringing prestige to the town. They saw it as an opportunity for infusion capital, and it was very much in times with what else was going on in the state. This was around the time that Norwich Free Academy was founded, and it was very bucolic. Canterbury is a beautiful town, it still is, and Thompson, which is closest proximity to Boston, had already become very popular as a tourist destination, and they had become very wealthy from this, and this was Canterbury's motivation. Now, when Prudence was retained, the town assisted in getting her a home, and she had actually converted to the Baptist faith before she moved to Canterbury, although she was educated in Quaker schools. She taught a very demanding curriculum to her young ladies. She taught exactly what was being taught in male boarding schools. So it was not embroidery and dressmaking. It was math and science, what science existed at the time. So she was a very demanding taskmaster. She felt very strongly that these girls should be educated on a par with their peers, and it was very successful. She had students from Philadelphia and from Boston, and it was looking to be a very big success until Sarah Harris asked if she could be admitted. And Prudence Crandall would have, I believe, have taught blacks and whites side by side. But, of course, this provoked a huge storm of controversy because the parents of the white children threatened to withdraw them. And this is what prompted Prudence to dismiss them all, send them home, and decide to confine herself to educating free black girls. And these black girls came from the same kind of families, successful families who could pay the tuition. Most of them were well literate by the time they got to Prudence's school. And, of course, Canterbury just was beside themselves. They just could not concede to this. Their desire for infusion capital was not compatible with a school full of freed black girls. There was no law under which to charge her. There was no way to stop her. So they passed the black law, which basically made it against the law to provide instruction to colored people who were not residents. So it was kind of a convoluted law. Philip Pearl of Hampton was actually on the committee to pass that law. And it was the beginning of the formation of a collective conscience that formed in the area, because almost from the very beginning, Prudence sought out the advice of William Lloyd Garrison. Arthur Tappan, a multimillionaire from New York, financed her trial. And the Reverend Samuel May, who was a Unitarian minister in Pomfret, was also very active in her defense. Now, this is an interesting point, because the Reverend Samuel May, his life's work was peace activism and civil rights. And at the beginning of the Prudence Crandall affair, he was actually very active in the colonization movement. His feelings about emancipation were unclear. He still hadn't decided. And if Prudence Crandall's troubles could change Samuel May's conception of what was right and wrong, then it really isn't surprising that she was able to change the minds of the rest of the county. And it's important to remember that the identity of living in a county was much greater than it is today. County government was very much a part of everyday life. There were county offices that were political plums that people competed for. So the people of Windham saw themselves as belonging to this corner of northeastern Connecticut. Now, this prompted a press war, a media frenzy. The Norwich Courier wrote, "The public will now understand that it is a crime to give instructions to colored persons who are not inhabitants of this state. Will the good people of this state countenance such a law?" The New Bedford Mercury said that Prudence was courageous and enthusiastic, if running perhaps a little too fast into trouble. And the London Times, because this was even an international story, termed the whole prosecution ridiculous. Now, they weren't able to she spent time in jail in the same cell block as a murderer, which also led to great horror among her followers. But they were unable to stop her. She continued on until Canterbury just got to the point where they were terrorizing her so badly. They fouled her well. They broke her windows. They tried to burn the Prudence Crandall school down. And eventually she did leave. But the lasting effects were immediate. The second anti-slavery group in Connecticut, which was founded in Plainfield in 1833 during her trial, was the second in the state. And that very same year, Samuel May and George Benson, who was an activist in Brooklyn, founded the first abolitionist newspaper, which was called the Unius. Unfortunately, no copies of that remain. In 1836, 6 of 15 anti-slavery societies were in Windham, and in 1837, 30% of all the anti-slavery societies were in Windham. Now, this is a very sparsely populated county. it's that those percentages definitely are not in keeping with what should have been there if you were basing it on population. Philip Pearl from Hampton, who was on the committee to draft the Black Law, actually led the drive to repeal it. And he became the founding president of the Connecticut Anti-Slavery Society. The county of Windham was also active on the Underground Railroad, and the only way that I was able to find this out, because when you speak about the Underground Railroad in Connecticut, you usually think about Litchfield County. And in 1921, a schoolgirl in Ohio was doing a research project, and she apparently got the names of some of the descendants, probably the grandparents of people who had been living in Windham at the time. And she wrote letters back to them asking about their relatives' involvement in the Underground Railroad. These letters eventually got preserved in the Seaboard Underground Railroad collection. That's a wonderful, wonderful resource. But had this girl not been doing this research paper, we probably would not even know that. At the time of the Civil War, then, abolitionism was firmly in the collective conscience. Windham was ashamed of what had happened. They could not abide being known as the persecutor of Prudence Crandall. That they had a strong anti-slavery tradition ever since colonial times, since revolutionary times. But, of course, there's a big difference between being anti-slavery in an economy which doesn't support slavery to begin with and actually the activism of the abolitionist movement. And this was the transition that was made. So when the soldiers started writing home immediately about how they were out there fighting to end the war, it wasn't surprising. There was no rebuttals in the paper. There was nobody contradicted them. So it was apparently a very, very widespread sentiment. Now, if they needed wider spread sentiment, in 1862, Joseph Danielson, who was a very prominent citizen in Danielsonville, took a job as Port Royal Experiment as a superintendent in the Port Royal Experiment for the Freedmen's Bureau. And Joseph Danielson's feelings on abolition within the community were very well known before the war. He was not an abolitionist. And when he went to Port Royal, his eyes were opened, and he came full circle, and he wrote for the paper a 16-part series called Life Among the Contrabands, which helped to reinforce this collective conscience, this convicted consensus among the residents that the men that were out there fighting for slavery were doing the right thing. Obviously, this Joseph Danielson was held in quite high regard, and to have him change his mind as a result of his exposure to the former slaves, and he wrote a very interesting letter about the former slaves that he encountered. Danielson said, "He is so much smarter than myself, or would be had he been free. When he meets me with doffed hat and deferential bow, I feel like telling him to hold up his head and show himself to be the man he is, but he cannot, for he's a black man and he knows it." Now, those words would have carried a great deal of weight, and they would have been reinforcing what was already within the community. Another leader that reinforced this abolition sentiment was the associate editor of the Windham County Transcript. His name was Wilkinson, and he functioned as an embedded journalist, but he had the misfortune to be captured at First Bull Run, and he spent over a year in various Confederate prisons, and he was the consummate newspaperman. He sought out people to talk to, and they talked to him. He just had that personality. He talked to former slaves. He talked to Union sympathizers. He talked to doctors. And he also wrote back of the positive impression that he was getting of the freed slaves. And this was another reinforcing fact. Now, there was a third very prominent citizen who gave Windham an abolition boost in the arm during the first year of the war, and that was the Dr. John McGregor, who was also captured during First Bull Run when he refused to leave his field hospital. And Dr. McGregor, you get the impression that he was the stereotype of the kindly but irascible county doctor, and he was promised a quick exchange, but instead of exchange, he failed to report an escape attempt and ended up being imprisoned under quite harsh circumstances for over a year. And when he was released, instead of paroling him or exchanging him, his captors took him out to the banks of the James River and left him for dead. And he was aided by an escaped slave who kept him alive with food and helped him flag down a steamer, which eventually picked him up. So all this news is being fed back into Windham County, and it's reinforcing the ideas that had been planted there by the Prudence-Crandall scandal and by the strong anti-slavery tradition that had existed there since before the Revolutionary War. And if they needed another reason to fight besides preserving the Union, this was definitely marked the county. It marked the county. The Windham County provided more officers, Windham and New London County provided more officers for the Massachusetts colored regiments than any other regiment in Connecticut. And they were very proud of this at the time. They wrote this in the paper. They were very proud that they were able to contribute to the leadership of the Massachusetts 54th, the colored regiment. So it was something that these people carried through to them. They were only 3 generations. The Civil War, 25-year-old men were only 3 generations away. And their grandparents and parents would have lived through this scandal that marked the county, that resulted in all this bad press. And the fact that their eyes were opened and their minds changed by Prudence Crandall is as great a credit to her as her efforts to educate the freed black girls that she tried to school. And she really didn't get a chance to accomplish very much. And that's very sad. But her efforts, her assistance by William Lloyd Garrison during her trial brought this infusion of abolitionist agents into the area. William Lloyd Garrison married Eliza Benson the year after the trial. And these formation of these family ties in Windham County, because Garrison traveled very, very frequently between Rhode Island and Hartford and between Norwich and Boston. So he was in Brooklyn a great deal. And this was just about the time when he had decided that these lectures in the cities were not getting him anywhere, and that the movement needed to move into the country, and Windham was ripe to have their minds changed. And it set up this presence of having this very prominent worker there to carry out the movement that emerged after Prudence Crandall. So that's about all I have. I think it's a very interesting part of Connecticut's history as far as abolition is concerned, and I'm very glad that I had the chance to speak to you about it today. Thank you very much.
Senator, if you'll join us, and Professor, if you'll join us, that'd be great. And we have a little commercial announcement for you.
I just want to let you know that in case you are so intrigued by the story of Prudence Crandall and you want to know more, that the building that she lived in and was her school still stands at the corner of in Canterbury at the crossroads, and it is now open as a museum owned and maintained by the state of Connecticut. And we have brochures out there that you can pick up. But also, because this is Black History Month, I think you'll want to stop and ponder for a moment that you are sitting in a building that is on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, as the Prudence Crandall Museum is another site on the trail, and that we want to pay homage to those who struggled for equality and freedom over the years. So pick these up as you leave.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Than's a chance for you to participate. We go on to our panel discussion, and I will give you an opportunity to ask questions if you'd like. Just raise your hand so that I can see you after we're talking for a few minutes. I believe we have someone sitting here in the front row who is wearing a hat that says General Robert E. Lee. We're very pleased to have you with us, sir. Very honored to have you here. Very nice. Joining me on the panel right now, our Senator Donald Williams. Don is currently in his 11th term representing the 29th Senate District. In 2004, Don was elected by the members of the state Senate to serve as President pro tempore, which makes him the highest-ranking legislator in the Connecticut General Assembly, and he's held that post ever since. The senator's district includes Canterbury, the site of the Prudence Crandall School, and the senator has had a very strong interest in the school and where its story fits into the abolitionist history of Connecticut and New England, and has been doing some work and some research on that. So thank you so much. This is more fun than where we usually see each other over the state legislature arguing over budgets and things. And our other panelist is Professor Ousmane Power-Greene. He is an assistant professor in the history department at Clark University in Worcester. His research and teaching focuses on African American social and political movements, including a manuscript that he's recently written on the American colonization movement. And Dr. Power-Greene has taught courses in African American history at UConn, at Hampshire, at UMass Amherst, and of course at Clark University. So thank you all three of us for joining us. Don and Ousmane, Carol pointed out that being against slavery did not necessarily mean that you were for emancipation and for freed slaves coming and living among us. Let me give you each a chance to address that a little bit, and Don, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Sure. In the 1820s, the American Colonization Society sort of took off. It was put together by a number of individuals, including Francis Scott Key, Henry Clay, and others. And the idea was to deal with slavery by sending the Africans back to Africa. It became kind of the go-to place for folks who were opposed to slavery but didn't want to embrace equal rights for blacks in America. And most folks in the North embraced that approach to anti-slavery. You had William Lloyd Garrison, who embraced the colonization movement. Samuel May, as Carol said earlier, also embraced that. So many people did. And then it was really up to a handful of folks. David Walker in Boston, who was a black activist and businessman. William Lloyd Garrison, after hearing and reading Walker's works. Elizabeth Hayrick, who was a British writer. These folks stood up. George Bourne, another American who was a minister. They stood up and said, this is a banishment of blacks. It's wrong, and we ought to embrace them. They ought to have equal rights in America. And that was a fundamental moment when finally folks started saying, colonization is not the way to go. And there was a divide in the anti-slavery movement.
Professor, you've written an entire manuscript about this, and one of the things that struck me, and I recently learned this from a talk that the professor gave and Professor Warshauer gave, was that at one time Lincoln was in favor of that approach as well.
Yeah, going back to what was just said, what's interesting about colonization is it was considered somewhat moderate or considered somewhat extreme in some ways and moderate in other ways, in the sense that people like Clay, who's a slaveholder, was a person who's president of Colonization Society, and saw his views as being kind of forward-thinking. And when Lincoln actually speaks at Clay's eulogy, he actually points out, maybe Clay's dream will be able to be kept alive. And of course, when the Civil War begins, Lincoln will, before the end, consider colonization. So colonization had been a kind of a major kind of ideology in America, in the North. And in my work, I look at the Midwest, Indiana, Illinois. All these places had whites who embraced colonization and saw that as something that seemed like a more realistic way to deal with slavery upon its ending. Of course, my work looks at black Americans' resistance to colonization, right? Because throughout the 19th century, soon after the American Colonization Society is founded, black Americans throughout the nation immediately meet and say, look, this is, slavery is terrifying, obviously, some of whom had left, but this notion that now we can be driven from our shores is almost equally as terrifying. And so throughout the antebellum era, anti-colonization, the resistance to colonization becomes one of the hallmarks of black abolition and black American activism. Going up to Lincoln, who is railed by Frederick Douglass and others, particularly for him initiating or even suggesting that colonization could be a way to, quote-unquote, deal with African Americans after emancipation.
Carol, I was really interested in what you described after the Prudence Crandall affair as a media frenzy, because I'm trying to picture in my mind media frenzy in the 1830s, what that sounds like and looks like. But you said that the story went all the way across, overseas.
It did. And of course, England or Great Britain was, safely across the river of slavery, and they just saw it as ridiculous. But for the little town of Canterbury to get notice in the London Times, especially in such a negative fashion. But going back, we make a distinction today between the concept of emancipation and abolition, which was in the 19th century. But there were so many shades of the abolitionist movement, and if you read their writings, you have gradualists and immediatists, and you have the approach that it should not be a political movement, that it, of course, Garrison wanted everyone to stop voting and stop participating in government. So there were a lot of different shades to a problem that really had only one solution.
And in fact, Senator, in 1779 in Connecticut, 2 slaves petitioned the General Assembly to end slavery. Their petition was denied. In 1784, after rejecting other emancipation proposals, Connecticut lawmakers did pass a law that provided for the gradual end of slavery in this state, so that it didn't free living slaves, but it stated that any children who were born into slavery after a certain time in that year would become free when they became 25 years old. And actually, the abolition of slavery really didn't happen in this state until 1848, 1849.
That's right.
The last in New England, I think.
That's right. As a matter of fact, that's the reason why the Amistad was towed from a port in New York into Connecticut, because at the time slavery was still legal, and the Navy folks who wanted to get their hands on the cargo, since the captain was dead, felt they would have a better chance in the state of Connecticut. So you're absolutely right. And it's fascinating. Here we are in the old State House, and this is where those laws were considered and passed. It was where, as Carol pointed out, you had the Black Law passed in 1833. It was in this very building that bill was debated and approved.
Professor, we have had an impression, I think many of us anyway in the state have had an impression that Connecticut was this hotbed of emancipation and abolition, and we look at the Connecticut of today and we think about people being maybe one of the more liberal states and all that, and yet that really wasn't the case here.
Yeah, I mean, the challenges for blacks who are living outside the South were enormous, from education, which is the central topic, to getting jobs, employment, and things. And again, with this backdrop of colonization, that ups the ante one more, because now you have people gathering together, taking their time out to gather together to contemplate this idea of blacks going to Liberia. And so, just dealing with the daily ins and outs and challenges one face, then to think that, these supposed friends, don't see black Americans having a role in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in other states at all. This is something that, of course, is very, very frustrating. And it's one of the reasons why black Americans were so adamant that they wanted to agitate against colonization, because ultimately their quest for citizenship was intricately connected to this idea that they had a place and they belonged in the United States, and in Connecticut and in the North. And so it reframes the debate away from just a question of slavery to, what are your opportunities here, in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in the old Midwest, as these new states are coming in, will black Americans be able to live there? Or will there be provisions in the state constitutions that say, that they should be sent to Liberia? These are pressing issues for black Americans, as they attempt to live in, there's a new book that's called More Than Freedom. You know what I mean? It's this idea that, ending slavery is one thing, but black Americans want more than freedom. They want equality. They want citizenship.
Mm-hmm. Well, you led me perfectly into what I wanted to be the next topic, which is, Senator, you've been looking into how the Prudence-Crandall affair really had an effect on history long past the date when that all happened, including some really significant Supreme Court decisions. And I want to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, it was a cause célèbre for the abolitionist movement in the 1830s, and it was talked about through the 1840s and leading up to the Civil War. Just before the Civil War, the notorious Dred Scott case written by Chief Justice Taney, with the eye toward ending the debate about slavery, held that blacks were not citizens, free blacks were not citizens of the United States, and also held that Congress had no authority to regulate slavery. Mm-hmm. And in the Dred Scott decision, Justice Taney cites Prudence-Crandall's court case for appeal to the state Supreme Court, which was thrown out on a technicality. The court never ruled on the merits. However, the lower court that was the subject of the appeal had a decision by Justice David Daggett of New Haven, and Daggett ruled that blacks were not citizens in his charge to the jury, and the jury agreed with that. And so he upheld the black law, and here in the notorious Dred Scott case, you have Chief Justice Taney citing the Prudence-Crandall case. Well, instead of putting the slavery issue to rest, Taney unwittingly opened the door to the Civil War because his decision satisfied neither side, neither the South nor the North. And then you fast forward all the way to 1954, and the Supreme Court considering Brown versus Board of Education. The question for the court there was, do we have a constitutional basis to overrule slavery? And it was the 14th Amendment that was the focus of their attention. And the question was, how could we say that the 14th Amendment, which when it was passed, was at a time when there were places like Washington, D.C. that had segregated schools, and they continued to have segregated schools. How can we say that amendment now gives us the ability to overrule other decisions upholding segregation like Plessy v. Ferguson and to strike down segregation? And it was a historian, Howard J. Graham, who had done some fundamental research linking the anti-slavery movement and the Prudence-Crandall case with the genesis, as he put it, of the 14th Amendment. And the kernel of his argument was that the Constitution is a living document. The 14th Amendment is a living tribute to those in the anti-slavery movement who wanted to strike down the differences in our society between black and white, who wanted equality. Ultimately, the Supreme Court embraced that view, and Thurgood Marshall, writing for the NAACP in the brief to the Supreme Court, cited the Prudence-Crandall case for that proposition.
Professor, I think that might come as a surprise to a lot of us who think Prudence-Crandall, although she's held up as our state heroine, little school out in this little tiny town, and yet to reverberate that many years later is really quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think that what's particularly interesting is the subject of education. Right? Looking at education as being a point by which people ponder greater questions, about, opportunity in America and things of that nature. And to see in these different moments, ideas of education as being something that, black Americans are striving for, and seeing the possibility of bringing people together, potentially maybe black people into white communities or black and white together in one school, as being seen as something as extraordinarily subversive. And I think the reason why has to do with children. The issue of one's youth and the possibilities of the future for on both sides, for whites on one side and for blacks on the other side. But again, when you think about works that are being done, contemporary works, thinking about the reality of equality in America. And, today, one oftentimes goes back to the inequality in terms of distribution in schools and things like that. So, I do think that, these historic issues, they bring up topics that, sometimes when you read the evidence, you realize, wow, some of the same types of ways in which people understand themselves in society are quite similar, surprisingly, so.
And Don, one of the things that I didn't give you much of a chance to expound upon, but Plessy v. Ferguson was really about separate but equal, whereas Brown v. Board of Education was about integration.
That's right. And ironically, it took that long, from 1833 to 1954, for the policy of the United States through the Supreme Court to say yes to what Prudence Crandall was trying to do. Teach black and white students in the same classroom. Because that's what she did. When she finally decided to admit Sarah Harris as a student, and it was her second request. It took a while for Prudence to get there because she knew that there could be would likely be some adverse reaction in the community. When she admitted Sarah Harris, there was a time when her school went on. And Sarah was a student, and she sat with the white students, and the white students did not complain. They knew Sarah Harris. Some of them had actually gone to a local district school with her. Some had gone to church with her in Canterbury. And it was the adults, not the students in the classroom. It was when the adults and the parents found out, that's when you had the problem. It took all the way to 1954 for us as a country to embrace this idea that integration is a right, and we cannot discriminate against those students, regardless of color, in a classroom.
Makes me even prouder of Prudence Crandall as our state heroine that she was that far ahead of her time. I want to give you all a chance to get involved. If anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you so that we can record you for the television program. But yes, sir.
One of the commentators commented that William Lloyd Garrison gave up on the cities as a place to stir up abolitionist sentiment. I just wondered why that would be the case, and why he would find a more fertile ground in the countryside for abolitionists.
Cheryl, I think that was something you mentioned.
Well, William Lloyd Garrison remarked that Connecticut was the Georgia of the North because of the fact that he was getting so much resistance. Now, why he thought that maybe didn't have the mob mentality that you would have in the country that you had. But he was very frustrated with the state of the movement in Connecticut, and taking it to smaller groups probably was just his way of being able to reach people on a more personal level.
Yeah.
Would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, just to add to that, part of what Garrison and the other abolitionists were doing, which actually has them break from the previous generation of anti-slavery activists, is the grassroots nature of it. Getting out there and organizing and attempting to galvanize people's consciousness. So I think that also speaks to this effort to move beyond the previous generation and really get out there and convince people to think about slavery in different ways and to kind of join the movement. So.
There are a lot of parallels between the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. It's just that they couldn't pick up the phone and talk with each other. But there was a lot of communication and letters, communication flying back and forth between the abolitionists in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Providence and New Haven and elsewhere. And Garrison was tied into that, and Prudence Crandall became a part of that. There was a remarkable meeting between Prudence Crandall and William Lloyd Garrison in Boston. She got on a stagecoach and took the day-long ride up to Boston to meet with him, to run this idea by him about having a school for black women. She knew that she could not do that on her own. She needed the help of an abolitionist movement, and her students were drawn not only from Connecticut, but many from New York City, Philadelphia, those other cities that I mentioned. And when they sat down, Garrison was prepared not to support her because he was afraid, based on the failure of a school, a college for black men in New Haven that had been proposed just a year and a half before. And the town had shot that down at a town meeting, a vote of 700 and something to 4. And he did not want a second failure like that. And at this remarkable meeting, Prudence Crandall convinced Garrison that here was a person who could get this done and follow through. And she came to the table with ideas that he was not prepared for, but then rose to the challenge. She had it figured out in terms of how his newspaper, The Liberator, could be a catalyst in raising awareness, recruiting students, and bringing support for her school. And so it was a tremendous collaboration that was quite unique.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Question, Senator Williams. You used the comment free blacks. In reviewing U.S. Census records in 1790, the early 1800s, there were numbers per people, and then there were
slaves, free blacks, and mulattoes. Those latter three categories were not counted in the total number of citizens or residents?
In Connecticut, you mean mulattoes as opposed to free blacks?
Answer to both categories, please.
Yeah, I'm not certain of that. I know the census data that I've looked at from that time period really will talk about white citizens, black citizens, and then before the abolition of slavery, slaves. I've seen those three categories in northern state census data, but that doesn't mean that there was other data out there. Yeah.
Question? Matt?
I just want to, speak to how innovative Carol's research and writing on this has been. This, as she noted, came out of a class at CCSU, and this is exactly what historians should be doing, and that is threshing through all of this information and fine-tuning it so that we can better understand it. And what she's revealed is absolutely remarkable in regards to how important it is to study local history. And, even going beyond local history in terms of the state of Connecticut, but rather focusing on a particular township, a particular county. And that really hasn't been done. So we historians have made a lot of comments about the history of slavery and abolition in the state of Connecticut, and in many ways, I view our conclusions as really quite preliminary. Far, far more work needs to be done on abolitionism itself within the state of Connecticut, because it just hasn't been studied that carefully. And so Carol's work is, at the top of that pile. So with that, I do have a question. I'm curious to know from Senator Williams how the movement to make Prudence Crandall our state heroine got rolling. And I know you had a lot to do with that, and I'd love for you to speak to that.
I wish I could say that I had a lot to do with it. I was a new senator at that time, and there were others, quite frankly, in the legislature who had got that ball rolling before me. So I can't take credit for that. Certainly supported that, but there was a long road to that, because Prudence Crandall, even in the aftermath, was not revered in the state of Connecticut. People know that in the late 1880s that the state granted her a pension of $400 a year, and they were basically guilted into doing that by the media. The media had discovered through a recent 4-volume biography of William Lloyd Garrison, they rediscovered the Prudence Crandall story. They realized she was still alive in Kansas, and then a campaign started to do something for her. Now, the legislature in the new legislative building at that point, the new Capitol, considered the pension, and the Appropriations Committee said no. The Appropriations, they didn't want to do it. And some legislators said, well, you know what, the statute, if there was a time to object, the statute of limitations has run. And there were other legislators who said, well, the black law, it was a bad law, but it was the law, and she broke the law, and we shouldn't reward her for that. They came up with every excuse. And then there was a media frenzy, a storm of protest, and the Appropriations Committee got back together, reversed themselves, and the pension was approved. Fast forward then to 1911. And the Connecticut legislature once again considered a memorial to Prudence Crandall. And it was going to be built originally in Canterbury, then they decided in Plainfield, then they moved it to Canterbury. Then the Appropriations Committee, once again, didn't want to appropriate the money for it. The state of Rhode Island shamed the state of Connecticut and said, we'll give you $150. Come on, Connecticut, step up. And finally, the Connecticut legislature then appropriated $300. They put a committee together to decide how to memorialize her. 4 years went by. They couldn't agree. There never was a memorial. So fast forward all the way to 1995. That was the point at which the Connecticut legislature said, yes, she will be the state heroine, and we'll have a statue of her in the Capitol.
Wow. Carol, I just want to expand a little bit upon what Dr. Warshauer said, which is the importance of studying local history, because in your master's thesis, you are now looking at Litchfield County. Tell us a little bit about how different that was from the experience in Wyndham.
Well, this is an overview of the whole Civil War experience of these two counties, not just the aspect of abolition. But I decided to do this because they are so similar in geography and background, size. They're both very rural. Very different reactions to not only to abolitionism but to the Civil War. I mean, you had large pockets of very vocal pro-Southern sentiment in Litchfield County and in Fairfield County. You had virtually none in Windham County. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, which are rooted in revolutionary tradition and the days of the early republic, basically. But if you look at the two newspapers that ran, because both towns had local press that ran throughout the Civil War, the Windham County Transcript tasked itself to becoming a vehicle of education and communication for the soldiers, because it was sent to every regiment that had soldiers in the South. And it reinforced these ideas when the soldiers are writing about abolition and preserving the Union. Litchfield, the local press, did not function that way. It changed very little in size or scope from what it was at the beginning of the war. It also has to do with ancestry. You had a much bigger base of immigrant influx after the Revolutionary War to Litchfield than you did in Windham. Windham, everybody was related to one another, basically. You had no appreciable immigrant population.
Ousmane, one of the things I find interesting about the abolitionist sentiment in Windham is that when I think about Windham County, I think about textile manufacturing.
Yeah.
And so I guess my assumption, as not as an historian, is if you have major textile manufacturing, then you probably have some economic dependence on cotton coming from the South. And of course, cotton was dependent in part on the slave holders. So that to me makes it even more extraordinary that Windham had this sentiment.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, because I was just thinking, Professor, about my first experience studying anti-slavery really came from Samuel Hill, who was a Connecticut native, Willimantic. I was taking a course with Bruce Laurie at UMass, and I came down to Connecticut to look up and try to track down this person who would go on to establish silk production in Western Mass. And through that research, looking at him, I began to first learn about that connection you just raised, which is, the relationship between Connecticut, cotton, more broadly, shipbuilding, et cetera, these types of things, to rethink, this notion of connection out in slavery. So again, I agree. People in here looking at individuals who maybe, in my case, I was living in Northampton, so I was curious about anti-slavery in Northampton, Massachusetts. But it does take you on a journey to follow to some of these smaller towns, to meet wonderful people, local historical societies who can show you some papers for individuals or organizations. And so as I really think that it's crucial that we look at all the different organizations, all the different moments, the individuals involved, because we begin to see and begin to map out, first, the challenges they faced, number one, because you learn things like, most people in Northampton weren't actually necessarily, Massachusetts were never necessarily, against slavery or saw Southerners who came into Northampton who brought their slaves didn't necessarily see that as bad, and it's through that kind of work that I did as a graduate student. I began to rethink a lot of what I knew from the bigger narrative. So yeah, I think it's crucial to make those connections. And I think they can be made best by at least thinking bigger, like some of the bigger connections. But again, really looking at the local individuals who are involved in it. So.
Senator, what about that economic connection with the power of the textile business in Windham County?
Sure. It definitely contributed to mixed feelings in the North about the purpose of the Civil War, going all the way back to colonization, and folks wanting, on the one hand, to deal with the slavery issue in some way, but not in a way that would upset the economic advantage that the North had in terms of getting those raw materials and the cotton from the South. So you really had a campaign by the abolitionists through the Civil War to educate folks. Prudence Crandall during the Civil War was in Illinois, and Garrison and his associates sent a booklet out, a pamphlet written by Lydia Maria Child about ending slavery in the West Indies. But it was essentially a parable about how you can end slavery and still go on with a good economy, and have social calm as opposed to rioting. And they passed these out. She passed them out to the Union troops in Illinois, as did many other abolitionists all across the North, because they were selling that concept that, no, the Civil War isn't just about reuniting the North and South for the North's economic benefit. It is about ending slavery and emancipation for the blacks.
Would anybody like to ask a question? We have about 5 or so more minutes in the program. Anybody in the audience who'd like to say something? Yes, Bessie?
I'm just curious. I grew up in Panama, and I know that Panama was one of the countries mentioned in terms of sending the slaves from here to other countries. Were those countries ever involved in the decision, or were they just going to be brought there imperialistically? And
this is part of the major debates that go on about the interrelated nature. First thing I started thinking about were Southerners who attempted to flee the South to take their slaves to Latin America in an effort to, thinking particularly of Brazil, in an effort to, the fear of slavery ending. So that was the first thing I thought about. But you raised an important point. What is the relationship between, black Americans' desire to leave the United States and form possibly a separate place, and the various efforts to promote blacks, being sent someplace, which is at least how black Americans saw it, regardless how it was refashioned by the colonizers. They tend to see it as being forced someplace. But the question about the imperialistic nature of the American Colonization Society, the colonization movement, tends to really focus more on West Africa than Latin America, right? Thinking about Liberia and the possibilities of what Liberia could mean or ultimately would mean for West Africa. Some whites thought, hey, this would be great to get involved in trade, and Liberia could be a beachhead for that. Others said, the practice of enslaving Africans continues to persist, despite efforts by, the United States government and Britain. And so possibly Liberia could be a beachhead against that. So there's always kind of been mixed motives, economics and others, for possibly sending blacks to places. Some maybe, as one historian critiques, says it's imperialistic, and others, are uncertain about to what degree that could actually happen, the success of doing it. But in terms of, a global, or at least an Atlantic world, thinking about the intersections, these are all part of the conversation, over black Americans, free labor. One of the big movements in the 1820s and later 1860s was a movement to Haiti. And in the 1820s, they would say, like, if Southerners would see the success of free labor in Haiti, then maybe they wouldn't be so terrified that, when slavery would end, that, blacks wouldn't go back to work and continue to work. And so there was a constant discourse around this idea of free labor, as being efficient, if not better. Obviously leading by the British abolitionists, obviously, because of the West Indies ending slavery. But yeah, there's a whole, it really does intersect with a lot of aspects of kind of American history and, Atlantic world history, Latin American history, West African history.
And what proportion of African Americans embraced the idea of colonization and thought it was a good idea to return to Africa?
Yeah, so this is one of the central debates. There's a small group who support colonization, but black Americans continue to remain interested in leaving. Right, so that gets confusing, right? So when someone says, "Oh, we're thinking about starting a movement to go to Haiti," black Americans join Haitian immigration societies. Oh, this could work. We'll send people out, etc. Even by the 1850s, when Martin Delany and other black Americans say, "Hey, we're thinking about immigrating to West Africa," they would say, "No, not Liberia, though." Right? So they would always make that distinction because among most black Americans, Liberia just had such a negative connotation with the American Colonization Society and this fear that deportation will become national policy. And so, again, there's, it gets tricky in that sense of, is it an affirmation of one's sense of identity and the sense of attempting to, leave America and leave the frustrated feelings that some blacks had about living in Connecticut or the States, and colonization, as a movement that black Americans consistently saw as despite the colonization's effort to explain that they didn't want to deport black Americans continue to rail against them, say, no, it's a mass deportation scheme they would use.
That's interesting, Don, that the professor says, this fear that it would become a national policy of deportation. I guess I hadn't really thought about the implications of that.
Well, and that's why you had black leaders in the North, and David Walker in Boston and others in New York City, really come out strongly against colonization. If they were going to go back to Africa, it would be on their own terms. It wouldn't be part of a national policy led by white men as a convenient way to deal with their guilt about slavery, and yet at the same time kind of keep the South as an economic partner. As a matter of fact, many leaders in the South wound up embracing colonization and managed to change the focus from freeing slaves and sending slaves back to Africa to sending the free blacks back to Africa. In an ironic way, actually increasing the value of slave labor by getting rid of a low-cost competitor, the labor of free blacks.
Interesting. Aren't we still kind of fighting that today, but now the labor's elsewhere?
Well, it's free trade is a whole other discussion.
And it may have been free labor, but compared to, the standard of living here, it's close to free. Does anybody have one last question that they want to get in before we wrap up our program? Yes, sir.
My question is, you speak of colonization, and I knew Frederick Douglass was very close to Abraham Lincoln. So on one hand, that's sort of Abraham Lincoln's thoughts, but then on the other hand, Frederick Douglass was speaking with him on fair pay, fair promotion, and the fair treatment of African-American captors. As we know, they were going to be killed on the spot, tongue slashed, as well as their officers. And if you have anything to say on that.
Frederick Douglass was a tremendously important figure in all of this. And, he was able to move the ball, so to speak, in a tremendous way when it came to folks like Lincoln. And there was a divide in the abolitionist community between whether the Constitution sanctioned slavery or not. And you had William Lloyd Garrison saying it did sanction slavery. And you had Douglass maintaining basically that it did not. And other folks arguing that you could construe in America under the Constitution without slavery. But he was a tremendous leader who had a fantastic impact with the publication of his autobiography that was arguably almost as influential as Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of helping push American public opinion against slavery.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, this is a tremendous letdown for black Americans. When they start hearing of Lincoln colonization plan, he's allocating money. This is a tremendous letdown. This idea that Lincoln could be a friend of the black man. When they hear about, when he brings people in, if he hears about this notion of colonization, it actually funds helping transport blacks, just outside Haiti. It's a tremendous letdown. You know what I mean? To people like Douglass, who saw the possibility of Lincoln. But on the other hand, when you look at that trajectory of Lincoln and you take him back to his mentors, thinking about Clay and others in the Republican Party, his views on colonization are actually not out of step with what others, Republicans and others had said, and so there's more consistency with that view as opposed to him kind of coming to it, kind of out of nowhere. It does make him more complicated, and it's led to tremendous debate. Beyond Glory, was a book that was published by Laurent Bennett, taking it back to the 60s even. This was the one thing this is the example of why Lincoln really had, racist views, and really looking at his colonization as kind of the quintessential expression of perhaps anti-black sentiment. So there's been debates about this, about who, the real Lincoln, or, what Lincoln's true views were about black people, because, centered around this idea. So, it goes all the way back to then in debates about him, and even up to probably present, even with Eric Foner's book attempts to deal with it more now. So,
I'm going to wrap up the program by giving each of you an opportunity to have about a 30-second last thought. But I just want to mention again that Carol's essay on this topic is going to be a chapter in a book that will be coming out this spring called Inside Connecticut and the American Civil War, One State's Struggle. And later this year. I'm not sure if it's the spring, but that'll be published by Wesleyan. And Carol, why don't you just give us about 30 seconds to wrap up what you're thinking now?
Just to re-echo my mentor's observations on studying local history, I think it's very important. The fact that this small rural county in Connecticut actually kind of stood alone as far as the abolitionist sentiment at the time of the Civil War speaks to the rural mindset. These people were considered by the rest of the state to be, pretty disposable, and they were pretty full of themselves because of it. And I think that's where that convicted consensus came from, is the fact that Wyndham was always politically or economically just getting in the way of what New Haven and Hartford wanted to do. And there was actually one election where the Republican, in 1860, when the Republican vote in Wyndham County completely outweighed the Democratic vote in New Haven, and they didn't like that at all. But these were the people, the backbone, and I think it's important to study rural history because of it.
Spoken like a 17th generationer.
Yeah. We finally gave up subsistence farming.
Ousmane, I know that your work about the colonization movement is also being reviewed as a potentially published book. We hope you'll come back and talk about it when the book comes out. But would you just give us about a 30-second wrap-up of what's on your mind right now?
Yeah. I mean, so a couple of things I've been thinking about, but one of which is, I think that students and others, we need to kind of reframe our understanding of this binary, this north-south. The South had slavery, the South was where all racism and anti-black sentiment was, and the North was the place of freedom and liberty, and everyone was. I think that part of the challenge is to reframe the kind of way in which we think about our regional differences, and for those who study the abolition movement and those who study colonization, other things, we start seeing links and connections that between individuals that really move beyond that kind of traditional binary. I think that part of the reframing is centering the role of Black Americans in the struggle against slavery and the abolition movement. Which is something that hasn't always been there. Obviously thinking about Prudence, Crandall, and putting women back into the center of the debates and agitating their own behalf, going to and being the movers and shakers and the thinkers, not just responding to the great silent army of abolitionists. They're that too, but there are some who really agitate at the center of that. And also recognizing, I guess the third thing is the reality of racial attitudes towards Black Americans, in the Midwest, as I mentioned in some of my work looking at, and in the Northeast, that would probably challenge some of our understandings of things from our history courses. So yeah, that's what I think.
Senator, when Carol said that Wyndham County got in the way of New Haven and Hartford, I think I saw you smile. Some things don't change, right?
Well, we like to work together, but we like it when Wyndham County wins. But, I would say that my takeaway, and I think what's most important about these issues that we've talked about today, is that we're not talking about dry, dusty issues that have long been settled. The issue of race, of discrimination, of equality, these issues that they grappled with in the abolitionist movement, in the Civil War, in Reconstruction, they have been with us, they are with us today. So I think that we can learn, we can be informed by what folks were fighting for, what they believed in, what they disagreed about in those times, because these issues are with us. Brown versus Board of Education, which I mentioned before, that didn't end the story in terms of even equality in education. There are those like Jonathan Kozol who would argue, we don't even pretend to work towards integration today. Now in 2013, going back to 1954, that seemed to be the supreme value. For Prudence Crandall, that seemed to be a supreme value of an integrated classroom. And yet some would argue that we have turned our back on that in many ways today. So these issues are present, and we ought to confront them.
That was the perfect ending. Thank you so much, Senator. And I want to thank you all for coming today and for being part of this conversation at noon. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Diane, and thank you to our speakers. I would urge you all to visit the Prudence Crandall House, to visit the Freedom Trail, to go to your local historical societies to learn about your own community, and to always come back to the old State House, which was so critical to this story. Thank you for coming today.